Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, in which three rabbis from Englewood, New Jersey, each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Rabbi Chaim Pupko of Congregation Ava Torah, and I'm joined by my dear friends and colleagues,
Rabbi Akiva Block, Kihilat Kesher,
and Rabbi Daniel Goldberg, Eitz Chaim, the Englewood Stiebel.
To sponsor an episode of the One Pasuk podcast, visit onepasukpodcast.com and click on the sponsorship link. And please take a moment and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast platform. All right, Rabbi Goldberg, set us up.
Okay, so for the pasuk that I chose for this week's One Pasuk podcast comes from Shmos Lamed Ches, pasuk Ches 38:8, the end of Vayakhel, and the Torah is discussing the construction of the clay hamikdash, the vessels of the Mishkan, and it says Vayas es hakior nechoshes vikano nechoshes, and they made the washstand of copper and its base of copper. Bimaros hatzovos asher tzavu pesach ohel moed. From the mirrors, and it's hard to translate this without having to choose a particular interpretation, but I'm going to choose the one that's in front of me. From the mirrors of the women who had set up the legions, who congregated at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And I guess if they're usually you ask why I chose this pasuk. So firstly, I think the kior, the wash basin, is maybe an under-discussed, one of the lesser analyzed clay hamikdash vessels in the Mishkan and the base hamikdash. And so I think there's fertile ground here. No pun intended. I also think that the question of the provenance of these mirrors and where they came from which the wash basin, the laver, was fashioned, I think is also very, very interesting territory to discuss. And I guess since I teed up the pasuk, you begin the discussion, and then I'll offer my own thoughts. Though I imagine we'll end up in similar terrain, I think it takes us into very interesting terrain.
I'm just saying, I think you set me up because last week I raised the pasuk and I went first. So
it was a setup.
Yeah,
that's right.
But
I'm happy to go first.
Yeah.
Should I go first?
That's okay. That's okay, Rabbi Goldberg. I'm happy to take the bait, and I think you guys are hazing me because I never actually. I'm really the only outsider here. I never worked at Avos Torah. No, but I think also last time you chose a pasuk, I quoted Indiana Jones, and I quoted the movie incorrectly, and so I have to be Modal MS. I said you chose well, but the guy really says you chose wisely. So you chose wisely.
Okay, thank you.
We're all familiar with, and if we're not familiar, all of our listeners should be familiar with this really, really beautiful, lengthy, but very beautiful comment of Rashi, where he actually, it's hard to imagine such with such a lengthy Rashi, but he really does quote an abridged version of the Tanchuma. But Rashi says the whole thing with these mirrors was that originally Moshe didn't want to accept them because mirrors are instruments of vanity and beauty, which isn't necessarily what we should be focusing on primarily in the Beis Hamikdash and the Mishkan. And therefore, Rashi says, "V'haya moes Moshe bahen mipnei she'asuyin liyetzer hara." Moshe was kind of disgusted by, it was a davar ma'us, he was disgusted by it because these are things that cater to a person's most base impulses. They're yetzer hara. And Hashem said, "V'amar lo HaKadosh Baruch Hu kabel," accept these mirrors, ki elu chavivin alai min hakol, because they are more dear to me than anything else. And then Rashi goes on to describe why these mirrors were so dear in the eyes of the Ribono Shel Olam. And there's just really one phrase in the Rashi that just is so incredibly profound and inspiring to me. Rashi goes on to explain that in Mitzrayim, when the husbands were engaged in avodat parech, in backbreaking labor in the fields, they would bring them food and drink and feed them, and then they would take the mirrors, v'notlos hamaros, v'chol achas ro'eh atzma im ba'ala b'mar'ah u'mishadalto bidvarim. So the wives would go out to them in the fields and bring them food and drink, and when they got home, instead of maybe what we would expect to read, which is they made themselves beautiful and enticing for their husbands. That's not what happened. And I think this is part of the reason why Hashem found this to be so beautiful, maybe the most beautiful of all. They took the mirrors and they looked at themselves together with their husbands in the mirror and said, Ani na'em imcha, I'm more beautiful than you are. And the picture in the mirror, which they were looking at, which was so incredibly beautiful and which spawned and resulted in the production and the perpetuation of the Jewish family, is a picture of the husband and the wife together. The vision of the couple together in the mirror is what inspired, or what re-aroused, if you will, the desire and the impetus and the motivation to perpetuate the Jewish family. And I think it's such a beautiful image of the husband and the wife together. Look, we're in this together. It's not easy. Look at how beautiful I am. The beauty, I am more beautiful than you, the wife says. That's not catering to the Yetzer Hara, Hashem says, Moshe. That is the epitome of what the Jewish family is all about. The wife is beautiful and the husband is handsome and they're together, but they're beautiful for one another, together looking at each other in the mirror. And that is kabel ki elu chavivin alai min hakol. The notion of beauty and vanity and appearances as something that doesn't exist in a vacuum, but as something that exists as the two of you look together in the mirror and can see one another together. That's the inspiration for the perpetuation of the Jewish family. And we would be remiss if we didn't also say that what's really the most beautiful, I think this dovetails off the point, which is the idea that the cornerstone and the foundation of Jewish life is the home, and the family is something that is chavivin alai min hakol. You think that the home is one thing and the shul, the Beis Hamikdash, the Mishkan is the other thing. No. A beautiful and rich Jewish home that is focused on all the right things is actually chaviv and alai min hakol. The Jewish family has a place in shul, not only a place in shul, in the kior, and I think the vision of the two, the husband and the wife together, really, I think, reflects that, no pun intended, quite beautifully.
Yeah, this medrash is just so incredibly beautiful and provocative on so many different levels. I loved what you focused on, the Ani Na'eh Mimcha. Maybe the Hasidic reading of that could also be Ani Na'eh Mimcha, I'm beautiful from you, meaning as a result of you. I'm beautiful in your eyes. That's why it's the two of us together.
Yeah.
The Pashup shot is that it's this kind of playful moment of, like, you can imagine in the modern context, you're taking a selfie where the two of you are looking at the screen together. So this was like the ancient technology where you could, like, look at yourselves.
This was the ancient selfie.
This
it really
was the ancient selfie. That's really the image that I have. But yeah, the Hasidic, Ani na'eh mimcha, I'm beautiful from you, as a result of you, in your eyes. I see myself as beautiful because of you. So maybe that's another layer here.
Precisely the idea. But exactly. It's the opposite of vanity, actually, because it's beauty that exists in the context of a relationship.
Nice. So I'm so grateful to Rabbi Goldberg for choosing this pasuk with this Rashi, because it gave me an opportunity to study this Rashi, which many are familiar with. And that phrase, Ani no'em imcha, really caught my eye, because it doesn't mean that I'm making myself beautiful for you, which is what we would expect it to say based on what we think about the Medrash. But read literally, Ani no'em imcha, I am more beautiful than you. So I looked up the Tanchuma, and it's interesting because Rashi changes or leaves out a few things from that Tanchuma. But one of the things he leaves out, as you guys mentioned, is that she says, Ani no'em mimcha, and he says, Ani no'em mimech. So the first thing we learn, as you guys mentioned, is that they're both looking in the mirror together. It's not just her looking at herself. And what I saw in that is there's a playfulness, right? They're teasing each other, right? So if you go with the whole story, so he's coming from the fields or building slavery, and he looks like whatever he looks like. And she jokes, I look better than you. And he jokes, what are you talking about? I look fun. And obviously the message, very similar to what we're talking about already, is the beauty and the sanctity in that playfulness, in the romantic playfulness, and that, and how much that goes to show us how important the home and the relationship is. But the question I want to ask, though, is why Dafka put that on the kior? I'm sure Hashem could have taught this lesson in many different ways, but why specifically on the kior? And so what I was thinking is that the kior represents this boundary line, the separation between outside the Mishkan and inside the Mishkan, right? When the Kohanim are coming to do the Avoda, when they're now stepping in to this more spiritually elevated place, they have to purify themselves, wash their hands and feet, leave something of the world behind them as they enter into sanctity. And it's specifically at that moment that Hashem wants them to remember the sanctity of real humanity. That even as they go into this space, they shouldn't think that the ideal level of Kedusha is being removed from this world and removed from our relationships. And that's dafka why Moshe didn't understand it and why Moshe rejected it at first. Because Moshe had to make that sacrifice to be Moshe and live an existence which was very different than everyone else's, speaking to Hashem panim b'fanim. And we know that Aaron and Miriam speak about his relationship, which, however we understand what they were saying, clearly reflects something about the fact that his relationship was affected by the fact that he spent so much time in the presence of God. And so it makes sense why Moshe wouldn't get that. But the idea of playfulness, and playfulness being something holy and sacred, it carries through beautifully because researchers have found how important playfulness is in relationships, and not just husbands and wives, but in every relationship. And I'll make a book recommendation. John Gottman and Julie Schwartz Gottman, who are legendary, very important researchers on relationships, and John Gottman has published many books. One of their books, which is really great, is called 8 Dates, Essential Conversations for a Lifetime of Love. And it basically spells out 8 different kinds of dates that a couple can have. And one of them is fun and adventure. And having fun and adventure is a critical piece of our dynamic. And so the fact that Hashem would teach us this lesson in this context is so beautiful, as you guys pointed out. And the way it does it is just so nuanced.
So beautiful. Again, I think the aspect you're picking up on, yeah, just it lights up another aspect of the Medrash that I haven't really thought about. I'm going to go one layer deeper. So Rabbi Block spoke about really the beauty of marriage and the beauty of the home, and then the playfulness from you, Rabbi Coco. And now I'm going to go one step further. It's actually about intimacy, right? This is what this is, right? And here you have the wash basin, which is the vehicle through which purity is achieved. And one would think this is the antithesis. You could have a worldview in which intimacy between a husband and a wife is the antithesis of what you would derive Kedusha from. And that's the misunderstanding. And as you said, it says this is the most chaviv. Because in the Jewish worldview, intimacy between a husband and a wife in the proper context, right, of Taras HaMishpacha is actually something that it's private. It's not something we celebrate in the sense that it's not something we're out there projecting and talking about. But in terms of Jewish values, the romance between a husband and a wife is an incredibly elevated, beautiful thing that Judaism celebrates. And that's what we're saying here, that it has a place. And it almost tracks with the discussion around Shir HaShirim, which is a book of romance between a dod and the ra'aya, and it's a metaphor for Hashem and the Jewish people. But some of the rabbis wanted to be ganuz. They didn't think that it had a place in Tanakh. And Rabbi Akiva says that it's Kodesh Kodashim, right? It's the same idea that it's the most beautiful, even though it's the most easily misunderstood, and it can be taken to be crass and coarse and inappropriate. But if it's understood and if it's in the right context, it's actually the most elevated. And here you have this very image of this thing, which was the vehicle through which husbands and wives had this romantic rendezvous. And Moshe understandably says, this has no place in the basement. And Hashem knows this is the most chaviv. And it's going to be the vehicle through which tahara is experienced. And it is in the lives of a husband and wife. It's the misuse of this thing is the lowest and the basest. But the correct union of a husband and a wife, and in the proper context, is the most powerful. And the idea that something could be mistaken for being disgusting by the greatest human being to ever live.
Right. And
at the same time, Hashem says it's the most chaviv in the Beis HaMikdash, the vehicle of tahara, is almost like this beautiful metaphor for what intimacy is.
I might frame it even a little bit differently in that which is most sacred is most vulnerable to corruption.
Right. Kadosh and Kadesh.
Yeah, right? Exactly. I love the idea, and I love that connection that you made between the Medrash says Chavivin Mikol, and Rabbi Akiva says Kodesh Kadashim. I think that's fantastic.
Rashi actually quotes Shir HaShirim. It's Tachas HaTapuach or Articha,
which takes us to Pesach.
I was actually going to mention that it's one of the sources in the Gemara for the mitzvah of Charoses, that Tapuach, Zecher la Tapuach, the Gemara says. So actually, in a very funny, almost ironic kind of way, this imagery is actually brought to our Seder table as well.
Absolutely.
Our most sanctified home moments are
Yeah.
actually infused with a reminder about the intimacy between husband and wife, that in the proper context and framework, this is actually Chavivan Alai Min HaKol.
And we say that women are obligated in the mitzvah of Daled Kosos because it's Afin Hayuba Oso Anes, and the Rashbam says Afin Hayuba Oso Anes means that they were absolutely instrumental in the particular miracle, like Esther was in Purim. So how were women instrumental in Yitzias Mitzrayim? It was Tachasa Tapuach or Articha. It's these mirrors. It's that they had this incredible commitment to the Jewish family and the Jewish future, despite daunting odds. So it all, there's so many layers here.
One other just point that you have to add: the kior is one of the only, maybe the only, of the kalim and the migdash that no shiurim are given, no measurements. And I forgot who says it, who says explicitly that it's for this reason. All of the maros of all of the people needed to be incorporated into the kior because they're all important, and it doesn't matter how big it is or what it looks like, because every relationship is sanctified, every marriage is beautiful, and it's actually reflected beautifully in the kior.
לילה יורד לאט, ברוח שושן נושבה, בהלכה שלך שיר בלט, זמר של אהבה. לילה יורד לאט, ברוח שושן נושבה, בהלכה שלך שיר בלט, זמר של אהבה. שחר הומה יומה, ראשך מהלת אל עלים, פיך אל הבוקר שושנה, הכתפנו לי. שחר הומה יומה, ראשך מהלת אל עלים, אל הבוקר שושנה, בכתפינו לי. לילה יורד לאט, ורוח שושן נושבה, בהלכה שלך שיר בלט, זמר של אהבה. לילה יורד לאט, ורוח שושן נושבה, בהלכה שלך שיר בלט, זמר של אהבה, זמר של אהבה.